Hi. So, as Sigmar introduced me, I'm American and I currently live in India. I started out as a young child. I grew up in just a normal American household. There was no particular religion. We were of Jewish origin, but there wasn't a lot of discussion of it. But I was particularly sensitive and aware. And when I was 12 years old, I announced to my parents that I was going to be vegetarian, and that was it. I put my foot down, and I had no idea why. I can't tell you what was going on in my mind. I was practicing yoga, and at 15, I discovered Autobiography of a Yogi, which was just a profound experience for me. Waking up, devotion, and spiritual desire that really shook my world. So, not sure how this works, but let's see. But I was also an empath, which means I could feel what was going on in the people around me, and I was aware of that from a very young age, and I assumed everyone else could feel the same thing I was feeling, and I still believe that we all can. Maybe it's just a matter of paying attention or learning. So it was no surprise that when it came time to decide what I wanted to do with my life, I decided to become a psychotherapist. I wanted to help people. I could feel people suffering, and I wanted to help. But the path to become a psychotherapist was not straightforward. There were some. I'm going to be telling you about my journey and my discoveries. So this is the sign of the Hindu Lord Shiva has his trident, and I placed it over the Greek letter psi, which signifies my journey, which was the journey of Eastern mysticism and Western psychology. So the Lord Shiva represents transformation, liberation, and destruction. So this is a little bit, for me, what we do in psychotherapy is we destroy our illusions, we become aware of our limitations, and we transcend. So we're continually in a process of destruction, liberation, and transformation. So again, I started out, wait, there's nothing on the screen. Right. I started out with spiritual pursuits, yoga and meditation, and didn't discover psychology till much, much later. And then I discovered psychology, and it was really difficult for me because I had been having many spiritual experiences and insights, and my own self-perception was different than what the schools of psychology that I discovered were telling me I was. So, and eventually, where I'm going to come to in my story is how I was able to join the two worlds, as above, so below. So, the Western idea of a god, or in this case, a goddess in the clouds, didn't interest me. I frankly rebelled. I rejected it completely. I went through a typical American youth of, saying there's nothing and we're just matter, and of course, until I discovered Eastern thought, and then I jumped in. So in this case, I rejected the Western image of an external god or goddess in the clouds. So then I went off to Europe, and I was living in France, and I went to Ireland for the summer. And on that trip, I was hitchhiking around Ireland. I was wearing my Grateful Dead t-shirt. It was 1984. Grateful Dead t-shirt, bell-bottom jeans, waffle stomper boots. Anybody remember those? Okay, this is a test. Yes, some people remember waffle stomper boots. Someone picked me up on the road and said, "You're at a crossroads. Your life is about to change, but you don't yet have the ability to know what I'm talking about. And I was like, okay. And I kept hitchhiking, and I met a woman who introduced me to some friends. And there I was in a beautiful home overlooking, I think it was in Galway on the coast. And someone was telling me about breathwork. And she said, you know, we work with people, teaching them to breathe, and we help heal their emotions and help them find their true selves. And I was 22 years old, and I was like, okay. I didn't quite understand what she was talking about, and she could see that. So she said, well, you want to try it? So she lied me down on a mattress in the bay window overlooking the coast and told me to start breathing. And in the space of 2 hours, what I thought was reality, which at that point we could say sex, drugs, rock and roll, and travel, became transformed into an infinite sense of the universe within. Emotions were coming up that I didn't know I had. And I didn't realize I was in a humdrum reality, a very limited reality, a limited sense of self, and that was just shattering away. And little by little, as each wave of emotion or each wave of perception came through me, I got the sense I was becoming more whole. Something was deeply happening. And at the end of the session, which I don't know how long it lasted, you lose your sense of time when you do breathwork. Who's done breathwork here? I imagine quite a lot of us, yeah. No sense of time, no sense of space. It's just experience, your own inner universe. I decided that that was it. I was going to become a breathworker. So I was actually in my final year. I was doing my Bachelor of Arts in International Business at American University of Paris. It wasn't the degree I wanted, but anyway. And I went back to Paris, and I found some people and started my breathwork training. Then after a while, I started to have a sense of being marginal. The only people coming to me were really new age. This was the 80s. There wasn't a lot of substantial research or solid techniques or degrees in my field in breathwork. And so, I was felt really like I wanted to deal with normal, everyday people with jobs and not just like, far out people like me. So I decided to pursue a degree. And that's when I signed up for a master's degree at Durham University in humanistic psychology. And then the discomfort of juggling all the years of experience in meditation and in breathwork and how do they fit into the finite world? At that point, humanistic psychology, there were very few people into spirituality. These days, it's maybe 50% of the people in the humanistic colleagues who are outright spiritual or who are open. But in the old days, there was an allergy. No, anything spiritual. I want nothing to do with it. So it was really uncomfortable, both in my own experience and also as a professional. How do I make the two worlds meet? How am I doing on time? Okay. So the degree in humanistic psychology was very interesting. I think in the early days, because I knew what was right and I knew everything because I was a breath worker. I think I was probably more of a sledgehammer than a therapist, and the approach of humanistic psychology gave me the ability to be gentle and to walk in other people's worlds with them with empathy and rather than knock them over and tell them right from wrong. So it was a lifesaver. However, my most spiritual colleague in the class described himself as being as spiritual as a paving stone. So this was in Northern England in the 90s. And furthermore, on the last day of the first day of the third year, we all went around in a circle, and everybody had to say what they were going to write their thesis on. And there was somebody saying, self-harm, male victims of rape, surviving multiple divorces, broken families. And when it came my turn, my topic was psychology and spirituality as complementary paths. And so I felt like, okay, we're colleagues, but where do the worlds join? So fortunately, very, very early on in my studies, I discovered my lifesaver, transpersonal psychology, and I read every book. I devoured it. In fact, most of the research, everything I did in my master's thesis was from transpersonal psychology. It was fabulous. It took away a lot of the frustration. However, even though I feel like in transpersonal psychology I found my tribe, there was a mystical longing in me. And perhaps we could say, it came out this morning in a talk. Dr. Kiran mentioned that it's not just about powerful experiences and altered states of consciousness. I was seeking transcendence and transformation. So I kept looking. And then I discovered the world of Ken Wilber, his integral psychology, which gave me intellectual fireworks. And I loved the maps he made of consciousness and how situating all the worlds together. It took me also further out of a value judgment-laden world of right and wrong. The discovery of spiral dynamics and all that made it a more gentle and a less judgmental world. However, I found it very intellectual, and it still didn't appeal to my spiritual longing. So in 2002, I was in Pondicherry. I used to spend every winter in India until I moved there. And I'm sitting at breakfast in one of the guest house dining rooms. Has anyone been to Pondicherry? And I pick up an article on integral yoga psychology. And that was it. The fire went off, and I discovered the school of thought that was profoundly mystical and yet structured to the Western mindset, because Sri Aurobindo did his studies in the West. It gave room for all of my experiences, my intuitions, my insights, my aspirations, and it gave me room to keep growing infinitely. So this became like my philosophical inspiration. Sri Aurobindo says that yoga is nothing but practical psychology. Okay, and what that means is we take the outer consciousness, the ego. There must be some kind of light here or something like that. Anyway, and that's what most of us, we start out with the unpolished form, the ego. And then the outer being, which we can distinguish as the physical being, the vital or emotional being, the mind, and the mind. And then we have like a sort of a midway ground, the inner mind, the inner vital, and the inner physical. And then we have the innermost being, which we can experience maybe in deep moments of meditation and this kind of thing. So when we talk about spirituality being nothing other than practical psychology, for me, that's been a path of sitting still and sitting with the inward voices and forces and impulses and impressions and all the things and the triggers from the outside, and making a map of it, looking in rather than out. And in doing so, what was once a sort of a vast pool of impressions and experiences and reactions becomes a detailed map of what's going on inside. And you start to get a sense of a deeper, more resonant voice emanating from within that noise, all that noise that was undistinguishable. And as we listen, it becomes distinguishable, and we start to distinguish a deeper truth coming from within. The psychic being, which is, you could call it the soul. So I devoured all the works of Sri Aurobindo. no, I can't say that. I devoured there's a series of books where his work is, it's based on his quotes. His books are, it would have taken me many lifetimes to read it. And about 14 years ago, after reading his books and talking with other colleagues in the field, I had an experience that was, basically I started having ideas about the state of our perception of ourselves, of psychology, of who we are, how we can heal, where we're going, what our potential is. And the ideas were coming so fast and furious that I had to record them. So I kept a little recorder with me 24/7. And for 2 months, day and night, ideas were just coming like a river. And at 2 months, it stopped. And I said to myself, okay, let's see what this is. I have all these recordings. And I started to transcribe it. And I was left with 300 pages of, well, there was sometimes middle of the night gibberish, so there was some inspiration, some insights, some ranting and raving, soapbox sermons, bashing of the West and putting the East on a pedestal. And then there was some valid material that I felt like needed to be expressed into the world. And again, that inner voice that we sometimes listen to and sometimes don't want to listen to said, you got to write a book. So the book is out in the bookshop. It came out in January. So we start out looking at this, it's not supposed to be readable, so it's just an idea, that this is a timeline of East and West. We go back 30,000 years to the first symbols that showed that there was some kind of a spiritual quest or a spiritual understanding. And we go all the way up to date, and there's an East and a West. And what we see is in the East, and in the West, originally, there was one thought with different branches. So mysticism was the core of science, psychology, medicine, philosophy. And in the West, there are various phases where we can identify in history where we dropped down and started to separate and quantify and look outside rather than inside. So ancient Greece was one such time. Varying colleagues have told me, we've discussed it, where did we start to split from the core, from the mystical core, and relegate it to the world of religion or worse, to the world of pathology? So what happens then, obviously, is that we started suffocating with Freudian thought, and so we started reclaiming humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, etc., which for Sri Aurobindo can be described as the evolution of consciousness, that there's a universal truth which might look different to each of us and might evolve, but that's calling us to it. And so we're going to reclaim larger and larger until we go back to the original source, which is universal. So okay, in my book I develop. It's not very, very theoretical. I'm a practitioner and I'm a spiritual seeker. But I had a little theory that I put forth 4 pillars to my thought. And the first one is unity and diversity. So unity is a deep and subtle place in consciousness where there's an underlying oneness of all existence. So we're not talking about homogeneity, and we're going to leave the quest for homogeneity to the control freaks. Then the second pillar is the spiritual worldview. Okay, spirituality is in its essence an awakening to the inner reality of our being, to our spirit, self, and soul, which is other than our mind, life, and body, an inner aspiration to know, to feel, and to be. Of course, Sri Aurobindo, my hero. So a spiritual worldview in psychology places the soul or spirit at the center of our being and life purpose rather than the ego. It's pretty simple stuff. Then we talk about the third pillar, which is multidimensional consciousness. So we have the material, which in Sri Aurobindo's terms, there's a subliminal, submental, subconscious, the deep, deep unconscious stuff that we can sometimes get insights into. The vital, which is the one that speaks the loudest, the desires, the cravings, the emotions. And that can be partly conscious and partly subconscious. The mental, which is also our beliefs, conscious and subconscious, and the subtle, which is the superconscious, our memory of our every single experience in this lifetime, and and of all lifetimes, and the supraconscious, our memory of oneness with the divine. And then the fourth pillar is levels of truth. So I started out with, because I was initiated into Kriya Yoga, and we were taught that God is within, the truth is within, and outside is illusion, Maya. Okay, and that was really cool because it fed my judgmental self, and it's like it's either truth or illusion, and that's that. And but when I discovered the idea of levels of truth, everything's true. But the deeper we go, the more subtle we go, the more finely tuned, the more we sort out the wheat from the chaff, our perception of truth changes and evolves. And so I took on this, which is, again, less, it's less divisive, it's not divisive and it's not judgmental. It's just the truth is within, and there are many levels of truth. And we're each at our own level. So what that allowed me to do was to develop this table, which is partly taken from the work of Ken Wilber and other colleagues, where we look at levels of consciousness in terms of ways in which we're suffering, difficulties, pathologies, and the levels of consciousness at which they exist, and then the techniques that could be used. For example, just the known techniques that could be used to deal with things. So what it does is it takes away a one-size-fits-all approach, like I'm going to use psychoanalysis for everything or hypnosis for everything, and we say, wow, I can learn a wide variety of techniques, but use them also from a consciousness. Look at where in consciousness the root of the issue is, and try to deal with it from multiple levels of consciousness, not just the ordinary intellect or dialogue. So again, we're moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach into a multidimensional approach. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that psychology and spirituality, to me, are two sides of the same spectrum. Okay? There's no separation. On one side, we have the self with the stories and the experiences and the impressions, and as we go more and more subtle, we come into contact with the deeper, more subtle truths. Okay, so the balance between inner and outer, upper and lower. So I want to leave time for questions. So I found my truth in the East, and I know that there's been some talk here about the multicultural perspectives, and so we each have found our truth and are finding our truth continually in schools of psychology, schools of spirituality or mysticism. So I just thought that was cute to say that mine was in the East, and there we go. And I'd like to open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear. Yeah, you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm also a psychotherapist trained in integral psychology. Unfortunately, I've never known Ken Wilber, but I've been trained in Italy with Laura Boggio-Gilò, who has been also one of the founders of Eurotas. So I love very much a concept brought by Ken Wilber, which is the pre-trans fallacy.
Oh, love it. Yeah.
So it was in this regard that the first day in the panel discussion, I asked that question to Professor Groff, because sometimes we don't speak much about the spiritual materialism. No? So that in this regard, what do you think about this very important concept? No?
Yeah.
For example, me, in my psychotherapeutical practice, I treat patients, persons who come to me, and perhaps they feel illuminated. I also follow a yoga path, no? And instead, I try to help them understand that their level of development, cognitive development, tends to confuse pre-personal states and transpersonal states. And it's very hard to make them understand this difference. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that I've come across that more in groups that I facilitate, maybe in one-on-one, because I'm working more with an experiential approach, sort of guiding people to the places in themselves where they've bypassed for various reasons, and identifying with an ego that it disguises itself as a guru and this kind of thing. So, but yeah, playfully, creatively, and mischievously, yes.
Good, yeah. Is there any other question you have? I mean, otherwise, I mean, as we shared a lot on this Congress, and coming from Indology myself, and I very much like that you balance the over-identification with India first that we had for a while, and coming back and see we have a lot to offer in both ways, you know. So consciousness is an exchange, you know. So in that respect, thank you very much as a sister in spirit and practice. Thank you very much, Margot.
Thank you.
Yeah.